Hello friends, I hope you had a chance to watch the last video, and I wanted to pick up where that video left off a little bit with you and talk again about fiscal policy. And as we said in the previous two videos, fiscal policy is intentional government or intentional changes by the government, the national government, in spending and taxation that are intended to influence aggregate demand and therefore the economy. So, discretionary fiscal policy is when the national government intentionally alters the level of spending and or the level of taxation with the intent of influencing demand so as to influence the macroeconomy. Right, so that's defined in chapter 30 in your book, and then we redefined it here as well. And we also said that there is what we call appropriate fiscal policy, right? Or fiscal policy that would be uh, helpful in various situations. So if there is demand pull inflation, a circumstance where aggregate demand is at the full employment level of GDP is greater than the full employment level of GDP. So aggregate demand is greater than full employment. It puts pressure on prices to increase, right? And the problem there is that there's too much demand. The solution is to modify that demand. You know, cut government spending and or increase taxation, right? Remembering that when we alter taxation, it alters disposable income, which has the impact of altering consumption, right? So if there is an inflationary situation, demand pull inflation, right, where there's too much demand that people want to buy more than the full employment level of GDP, then the appropriate fiscal policy would be to cut government spending and or to increase taxation, right? On the other hand, if there's a circumstance where there's not enough demand to buy the full employment level of GDP, right? A recession, what it would be, the level of output would gravitate to an equilibrium below full employment, right? Because there's not enough demand to buy the full employment level of GDP, similar to what's happening now, right? Then the appropriate fiscal policy would be to increase government spending, and oh my goodness, that's what they're doing now, and to cut taxation. Oh my goodness, that's also what they're doing now with the stimulus package, which is, returning tax dollars to consumers, right? What's the intent of that? Well, to increase consumption, people get their stimulus checks if you're following the news, and they spend those. And government spending, right, increases government spending so as to bring the economy out of what they expect to be a recession. That would be the appropriate fiscal policy, right? Either or you could, government could choose to rely exclusively on government spending or exclusively on taxation or a combination thereof. It doesn't, well, it does matter in some ways, but either lever can be used or a combination of those levers can be used to adjust demand to the full employment level of GDP at stable prices. Now, typically what we find is this: liberals would tend to like increases in government spending. So if there is a recession, liberals would tend to favor increases in government spending. Conservatives would tend to support reductions in taxes, right? If there's an inflationary situation in the economy, liberals would be more likely to want to raise taxes, and conservatives would be more likely to want to get to cut government spending. But neither, these levers, don't have inherent, in a fiscal policy sense, there's not an inherent better lever or worse lever. Now, in other senses, you may argue, that there's a value, different values, but in a pure, altering aggregate demand sense, either lever is appropriate, right? Okay. Now, what we want to talk about is we want to extend this a little bit and talk a little bit about the dynamics of a fiscal policy initiative. So let's do this. Let's draw a recession, right? So get out your paper and pencil or pen in the comfort of your own home, right? Get it out. I'll wait. All right, that should be long enough, right? You have your paper and pencil, and I want you to do this now. I want you to draw the vertical axis, call that price level PL, the horizontal axis, call that output, a bow-shaped short-run aggregate supply curve, right? Draw that like that. I want you to draw a vertical line down somewhere around the middle and call that full employment, right? And where they intersect, call that full employment. And there you go. There's the economy at full employment. Now I want you to draw a second aggregate demand curve, right? To the left of the original aggregate demand curve. Right? Oh, I should go back. I don't think I mentioned I wanted you to put in the bow-shaped aggregate supply curve, the downward sloping aggregate demand curve. Mark that as full employment. Now draw a second curve to the left of that, and call that AD2, right? And you can see now that that's a recession, right? And I want you to draw the equilibrium on the PL line, right? Okay. Now, I want you to label these with numbers, right? So on the original equilibrium at full employment, I want you to label that $1,000, right? So what that means is that equilibrium in the economy is equal to $1,000. So if there's $1,000 worth of output, then there's going to be enough output to fully employ all resources, right? So let's list that as $1,000, right? Okay. Now I want you to identify the new equilibrium after a shift leftward in the aggregate demand curve as $800, right? So now we're saying as a result of something that caused aggregate demand to shift leftward, right? Some change in spending, right? The new equilibrium in the economy is at a level of output that's $200 less than what's necessary to fully employ all resources. Okay, right? So this is a recession, right? This is a recession. I mean, if you're following the news, which I'm sure you're not, but if you were, right? If you were following the news, they came out today and argued that GDP had declined on an annualized rate by 4.6 or 4.8%, which basically means the level of output is below what's necessary to fully employ all resources. Why did that happen? Because consumption declined and investment declined and net exports declined. So 3 of the 4 components of aggregate demand have gone down, right? Government has gone up, I'm sure, but those components have gone down. And as a result, the macroeconomic equilibrium is moving leftward. The level of output has declined. The level of unemployment has risen. And we find ourselves in a situation like I just suggested, right? That I just asked you to draw an equilibrium that's left of full employment, right? And I put numbers on it. I said, listen, let's make full employment 1,000. Let's make the recession output equilibrium 800. Now here's my question. I don't know what your picture looks like, and I don't know if I just described it well enough for you. But hopefully you have this picture, right? Now here's my question: if the full employment output's 1,000, and the new equilibrium output is 800, right? Then the level of output is $200 below full employment, correct? Right? If we were going to take fiscal policy and we were going to implement it, and we were going to change government spending, how much would we change government spending by? Now, this might seem like a trick question. You'd say, well, you old retired balding jerk, 200, of course, right? The full employment level is 1,000. The new equilibrium is 800. If we increase government spending by 200, that will push the aggregate demand curve to the right to full employment, and the economy will recover back to full employment. That is not correct. The appropriate fiscal policy in this situation would be for government to increase by some fraction of 200. Now you might say, well, why? Why would policymakers want to not fill the entire gap there? Why wouldn't they want to do that? Well, because when aggregate demand changes, whether it changes as a result of a government fiscal policy, right? Whether it changes as a result of consumers, panicking or having confidence, or firms responding to changes in interest rates, or foreigners responding to changes in exchange rates. It doesn't matter why aggregate demand changes, but when it does, there's a multiplying effect, right? Let's think about this for a second, right? The multiplying effect. And this is something that's intuitively appealing, and it's going to make sense to you, right? It's going to be a little confusing, but it's going to make sense to you. If government came in and said, okay, tomorrow we're going to spend $1 billion on a project, right, in some locality, what immediately happens? Well, aggregate demand goes up by $1 billion, but so does income. Now you may say, well, wait a minute. Why is income goes? Well, $1 spent is $1 earned. Has to be, right? So if government spent $1 billion, somebody had to get $1 billion, right? Because it doesn't go down the drain. Right? The money that is spent is always earned by somebody. Someone's expenditure is another person's income. Right? So government comes along and spends $1 billion. There's $1 billion now of additional income that has been generated because of that spending. The people that get that additional income are going to spend a part of it, right? We're going to say they're not going to spend all of it, but they're going to spend a part of it, right? They're going to spend a percentage of that additional income. Now, we know this. We know that there's only two things you can do with income: save it or spend it, right? So when new income comes in as a result of an increase in demand, which is going to increase income by the amount that it increases demand, right? Then people spend a percentage of it and demand goes up again, right? So does income, right? And then that demand and income goes to other people and they spend it. And that increase in spending is an increase in demand and an increase in income. Now, I mean, maybe a good way to put this is, with sports analogy, they talk about when there are playoff games, in a town, if there ever are again, if there's ever sports again, and they say, well, what is the local impact on the economy, right? Well, you say, well, okay, it's not just the people buying tickets. It's the people that are buying tickets, and then it's the people they're going to restaurants, and then it's the restaurateurs that then have additional income because of this, and they go out and spend money, and then the suppliers to the restaurateurs, they go out and they spend money, and there's a multiplying effect to the initial spending that's there. So if the government spends $1 billion, the impact is going to be greater than $1 billion. Right now, the stimulus package was argued to be $2 trillion. Government's hoping that the impact of that is far greater than $2 trillion, with taxation and spending, because that's going to be an infusion, and then people are going to get more, and then they're going to spend some and spend some and spend some, and there's going to be a multiplying effect, right? So then if our recessionary gap was actually 200, as we explained, then we would want to increase aggregate demand by some fraction of 200. But by how much, right? Well, it would depend upon what people do with additional income, right? I mean, if someone receives an additional dollar, what percentage of that additional dollar will they spend, right? Do we know this? Well, kind of. We kind of know this. And in fact, that notion is called the marginal propensity to consume. The marginal propensity to consume. Marginal is the edge, the last. Propensity is tendency. Consume is spending, right? So the marginal propensity to consume is what is someone going to do with an additional dollar. So even if I said to you, okay, here you go, I'm going to give you $50. Tell me what you'll do with it. And you say to me, well, I'm going to go with this $50 and I don't know, there's nothing to buy now. Maybe I don't, what you would buy, but I mean, at one time you would say, well, I'm going to go skiing. I'm going to spend it all. I'm going to go skiing, or I'm going to spend it all on corsages for the park. I'm going to spend 100% of it. You might say that. You might say, well, no, no, no. I'm going to spend half and save half, right? Well, the percentage that you would spend of an additional dollar is called the marginal propensity to consume. In mathematical terms, the formula is delta C over delta Y equals MPC. Write that down. Write it down on your paper. Delta C over delta Y equals MPC. So delta is change. Change in C over change in Y equals MPC. The change in Y is always equal to income. Y in economics is equal to income. So the change in Y is always going to be 1. So the change in C, so as a result of a $1 change in income, what are you going to get as a change in consumption? It's going to be some fraction of 1, right? So 1 over 0.75 would be, or 0.75 over 1 would be an MPC of 0.75, which would mean that people tend to spend 75% of additional income, right? That's the MPC. Now, if the MPC, the marginal propensity to consume, is 0.75, right? The marginal propensity to save would be 0.25, because there's only two things you can do with income: save it or spend it. Right? So if there's $1 billion of income infused, right, and people spend 75% of it, the initial infusion, they're going to save 25% of it. They have to. I mean, there's only two things you could do. Now, that marginal propensity to consume is what determines the multiplier, right? How much multiplication there'll be. The higher the MPC, the greater the multiplication. The lower the MPC, the less the multiplication. Now, you can figure out that you could do this. You could say, all right, let's get $1 billion, right? And all right, let's say the MPC is 0.75. And $1 billion, okay, what's the next round of spending? It would be 750 million, then 750, what's 75% of that? And then on and on and on and on. And you could figure out what the impact of $1 billion would be after all the multiplication, right? However, the easy way to do it, and the formula for the multiplier, is 1 over 1 minus the MPC. 1 over 1 minus the MPC. So if you plugged in 0.75 to that, which you could do, this is hard, I'm sorry. If you plugged in 0.75, the multiplier would be 4. So that $1 billion change in spending would have an impact of $4 billion, right? If the MPC was 0.5, then it would have a $2 billion impact. Now, this is hard. I recognize that. The multiplying effect is hard. If you wanted to do something, which I'm sure you don't, but if you did want to do something, I think it's chapter 12, I don't think I know. It's chapter 27 in your textbook, is a lengthy and interesting discussion about the multiplying effect. Now, I'm going to stop there after throwing it out to you and come back with reinforcing this before. It's really difficult to do this without a chalkboard and to be able to illustrate it for you. I feel sorry for you, but I mean this is an important part of economics. And certainly the government, when they did this fiscal policy action that they took, they had some sense of what they expected the multiplier to be. Actually, it's probably around, I think they're speculating around 2, for the multiplier. And that's would argue an MPC of 0.5. Well, we'll come back to this. All right, bye.